Hi, Jessica Nadav, bringing you this week's Devar Torah on Parashat Bo. This week I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I won't be giving a summary of the parasha. I'll be sending that out by text only. So this will be the Devar Torah only. So what I want to do this week is look more broadly at the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the story of the Exodus, of the coming out of Egypt, and in particular the call to let my people go. We all know that call, especially from things like the cartoon, to let my people go. So what's this call all about? So the Rashbam, who was a grandson of Rashi, claims that the only way to explain the story of the Exodus in Sefer Shemot, in the book of Exodus, is to say that the plea to let my people go was just a hoax. This is quite a daring interpretation. Let's look at this and find the basis for this interpretation, and let's come to a different conclusion ourselves. So we're so familiar with the story of the Exodus from Egypt from a very, very young age that we rarely pay attention to the actual texts, to the Torah's detail of that story. But if we look at the first 14 chapters of Sefer Shemot, as the Rashbam does, the story that unfolds is really quite different to what is commonly assumed. Let's look at it. Let's review the whole story of the Exodus in the Torah to try and prove Rashbam's basic assertion. So he asserts that Moshe never, not even once, asks Paro to grant Bnei Israel the freedom from slavery, or to emigrate to Israel for that matter. Instead, each time Moshe goes to Paro and demands, "Let my people go," he is only requesting permission to allow Bnei Israel a 3-day journey to worship Hashem in the desert. Then we must try and explain why Moshe never tells Paro the whole truth, in inverted commas, and why this was all part of God's master plan. So it is quite understandable that the saying, "let my people go," is commonly understood as a plea for freedom from slavery. After all, it's Moshe's recurring plea to Paro. Almost every time that they meet, he keeps saying, let my people go. Furthermore, the holiday of Pesach is commonly associated with freedom from slavery. We call it Zeman Cherutenu, the season of our freedom. So therefore, it makes sense that people would understand that Moshe's demand that Paro release the people is a plea to let my people go from slavery, from freedom from slavery. However, if we read the text carefully, it becomes quite clear that Moshe is making a totally different request, relating more to freedom of religion than freedom from slavery. And all we need to do is trace back each time that Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Paro to make demands on behalf of Bnei Israel. Going further back even, to the burning bush or the flaming bush, Hashem tells Moshe to go to the king of Egypt, and I'm going to loosely translate this, go to the king of Egypt and tell him, "Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, happened upon us, and now please let us go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to our God." That's in Shemot. Now note here there's no mention of any request of freedom from slavery, merely freedom to go and worship. And this is precisely what Moshe asks when he goes to Paro. He does exactly what Hashem says. And in Shemot chapter 5 we find that Moshe's request is only that, no more, no less, freedom to go and worship. You'll recall that the outcome of that first encounter with Paro was disastrous. Paro not only was angered by it, but he doubled Bnei Israel's hardship. He doubled the workload. Nevertheless, Hashem commands Moshe to go again to Paro and demand once again that they have permission to go and worship Hashem in the desert. This time, however, Hashem will provide Moshe with some leverage in the form of the 10 plagues to convince Paro to take his warning seriously. Paro had previously said, "Lo yadati et Hashem," I do not know Hashem. So now Hashem explains to Moshe that he will, quote, take the people out with great punishments, ve'yede'u Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem, so that Egypt will know that I am God. Paro doesn't know me? Well, now he will, is what Hashem is saying, in other words. As we know, it takes 10 plagues to finally convince Paro that it's in his best interest to allow Bnei Israel to go. Still, when Paro finally allows them to leave, only after the death of the firstborn, in this week's parasha, it's still only to worship God in the desert. Paro never granted Bnei Israel freedom from slavery or permission to emigrate to Israel, nor did Bnei Israel ask for it. So it's no wonder he never gave it. They didn't even ask for it. Never does Moshe even hint to Paro that they plan to leave for good. At every stage of the negotiations, Moshe rejects any concession or compromise, insisting that everyone must go, but it never suggests that they leave for good. Likewise, no matter how hard Paro's heart remains, he never ever voices any suspicion that Bnei Israel may be leaving forever. Not even after the 10th plague. What's Paro's immediate reaction when he hears the report of the death of the firstborn? And again, loosely translated, and he, Paro, called to Moshe and Aharon at night and said, Get up and get out. Go worship your God, Gedaberchem, as you originally, back in Shemot, requested. Even your sheep and your cattle take with you, as you requested. And here's the clincher. He says, and bless me as well. Not only does Paro allow Bnei Israel a 3-day journey to offer korbanot, to offer sacrifices, but he also even requests that Moshe bless him, that ask for a blessing on his behalf, that he gives him a mishabarach, so to speak. Ubarchemu gam oti, and you will also bless me. So clearly after the 10th plague, Paro only grants Bnei Israel permission to worship God in the desert, because that's all Moshe asked for. He didn't ask for anything else. This also explains why the entire Egyptian nation urges Bnei Israel to leave as quickly as possible. They want to make sure that Bnei Israel go and worship God so they can put a stop to these plagues already. And this explains beautifully why the Egyptians lend Bnei Israel their silver and gold. Bnei Israel are only going to worship their God. The Egyptians have every reason to assume they'll be back, and they'll get their goods back. That they'll get back whatever they borrowed. The final proof of this interpretation comes in next week's Parashat Beshalach, when Paro is totally astonished when he finds out that the Bnei Israel had escaped. And loosely translated, and it was told to the king of Egypt, Ki barach ha'am, that the people had run away. Now this pasuk only makes sense if Paro had not granted them total freedom, but only given them a permission to temporarily go and worship God. Had he in fact set them free, why would he be shocked to hear that they'd run away? That they'd run away in inverted commas. But of course, according to our interpretation, Paro is shocked for the opposite reason. Because Bnei Israel, having said time and again that they were only going to go and worship in the desert, did not travel into the desert. We'll see this next week, but Hashem had commanded Moshe to turn around and set up camp near the Red Sea, in order that Paro will say that they're wandering in the land of Egypt, for the desert has closed them in. In other words, Hashem commands Bnei Israel to turn around to convince Paro that they're not going into the desert. Had Bnei Israel continued their journey towards the desert, Paro would have had no reason to chase them. That's exactly where they said they were going. He agreed to let them go into the desert, and that's what they're doing. So it's precisely because they don't do what they said they were going to do, but instead return to Egypt and set up camp, that Paro now concludes, what have we done? We've been tricked. We've let them free from their slave labor. It's only now that that Paro realizes that Bnei Israel have left slavery. And what leads him to this conclusion? The answer is quite simple. Let's consider what Bnei Israel have done. Clearly they did not travel into the desert as requested. But they also didn't travel home to Goshen, i.e. back to their slavery, right? Instead they stay in Egypt and they set up camp by the sea. So what on earth are they up to? Paro reaches the obvious conclusion, or obvious to him. Bnei Israel have implicitly declared their independence in Egypt. So for the sake of national security, Paro must immediately declare war on them. This rebellious nation, right? If he doesn't attack them first, they're definitely going to attack him. They're numerous and now they're armed. And in fact, this is Egypt's greatest fears. Remember from Shemot, we discussed this when we talked about Shemot. This was Paro's greatest fear all along, was that Bnei Israel had become too numerous and they would either attack him or take over. Once war is declared by Paro, then all bets are off. And this explains why Bnei Israel were entitled now to keep all the goods that they'd taken from the Egyptians. Now they're a country at war. Now it's war loot. There can be no two ways about it. This is the story of the Exodus in the Torah. Despite all the numerous movie versions, cartoon versions, whatever you want to call them, and the popular understanding of "let my people go" is a call for freedom from slavery. In fact, in the Chumash, it's only freedom to worship. So this is all very nice, and it tidies up many discrepancies in the story. But this interpretation raises its own bunch of questions, right? Firstly, with Hashem behind him and the 10 plagues up his sleeve, Moshe should be in a position to demand anything from Paro, right? Why would he only ask for a 3-day holiday? He's got Paro exactly where he wants him. Why wouldn't he just ask for the whole caboodle? Ask for total freedom. Furthermore, what does he gain by not telling Paro the whole truth? Either way, Hashem tells Moshe that Paro's not going to listen anyway. He tells him that from the outset. So why not tell Paro the whole truth in any event? Why not tell Paro the truth from the start, if Paro's not going to listen anyway? Also, remember, in addition to his mission to Paro, Moshe's mission also includes to tell Bnei Israel that Hashem will take them out of Egypt and take them to the promised land. And this is exactly what Moshe does. Is it possible that 3 million people, that Bnei Israel knew the real plan and didn't say? Paro wouldn't find out? No rumors would come up? Didn't Paro have a security, intelligence? His own intelligence services or anything? How did 3 million people keep this quiet? And finally, is Hashem not powerful enough to bring the plagues capable of forcing Paro to let the people go? Freedom, complete freedom. Is it better to deceive Paro rather than to tell him the truth? So I want to suggest that there's no alternative to the way it all happened. And let's see why. Let's examine why. When we read about the story of Exodus, we assume that the only obstacle to Bnei Israel leaving Egypt and going back to the land of Canaan was the enslavement to Egypt. But if we consider the conditions realistically, we'll see that that's not correct. We realize that Bnei Israel had no alternative other than to remain in Egypt. Why? Bnei Israel's total population is about 3 million souls. To provide food and water for a population that size is not an easy task. But Egypt, thanks to the Nile, can provide for them. However, survival of a nation of this size in desert conditions, even for a few weeks, would be impossible. Even if Paro had granted them permission to leave, could a nation that size, of 3 million ex-slaves, survive a lengthy, arduous journey through the desert to Canaan? And even if they made it to Canaan, would they be able to conquer the walled cities and the armies, the armed enemies? As the Meragelim, as the spies would later conclude, it would be suicidal. And those are the people who witnessed the miracles of the coming out of Egypt. They said it was suicidal. So imagine the people who hadn't even witnessed that yet. They wouldn't believe that was possible. So without anything but a series of miracles, Bnei Israel have no option but to remain in Egypt. Add to that, Bnei Israel had been living in Egypt for over 200 years. Certainly in the eyes of the Egyptians, and most likely their own eyes, even though they may be third-class citizens, they certainly remain a distinct ethnic group within Egypt, within the society, within the culture. It is for this very reason that their enslavement begins when Bnei Israel becomes so numerous. Egypt fears they're soon going to take over. Dynasties in Egypt had been taken over by enemies, from within or foreign powers. Now they fear that Bnei Israel is going to take over. They're so powerful they can take over the country or join Egypt's enemies to do so. Therefore, despite all their hardships of their enslavement, without any miraculous divine miracles or divine intervention, Bnei Israel had no realistic alternative but to stay in Egypt. So when Bnei Israel cry out for salvation at the beginning of Sefer Shemot, they are an oppressed slave class who desire a lighter workload and better living conditions. They are not a people yearning for Zion. That's not on their radar. They just don't want to be so oppressed. They want a lighter workload and better conditions. They're not expecting anything more. They're not asking for anything more. So bearing all this in mind, let's imagine what would have happened had Moshe gone to Paro with this plan of emigration en masse to the land of Canaan. Paro would have dismissed him as insane, right? Moshe would have lost all credibility in the eyes of Paro as a leader. Paro would never have believed it. So instead, Moshe makes a very reasonable request. Let my people go to worship their God in the desert. So Moshe doesn't lie to Paro, nor does he deceive him. He simply makes the legitimate right of religious freedom of an oppressed people. Furthermore, can Hashem punish Paro for going against a plan that seems to be suicidal? Had Moshe said to Paro, hey, let my people go, because we're going to migrate into the desert with all the hardships. If Paro would have said, sorry, that's never going to work, that's a suicidal mission, how could Hashem punish him for that? Everybody thought it was suicidal. But if Paro then just refuses their right to go and worship, now Hashem can punish him. So there's no point in Moshe demanding that Paro allow Bnei Israel to emigrate. Instead, he just demands the right to worship. Period. And this is not a lie, because that's exactly what Bnei Israel are going to do, right? First of all, they're going to go to Har Sinai. And there they will offer korbanot, they will offer sacrifices. So he's not lying. And this explains why Paro never accuses Moshe of planning to take Bnei Israel out forever. Because Paro never even considered this a realistic option. Nobody did. So what's Paro worried about? Why is he so adamant about them not going for a few days into the desert to worship their God? And the answer is quite simple. And it explains every problem that we've spoken about so far. Paro only has one fear. And we said this from the beginning, that his only fear is that Bnei Israel will take over his country. If he lets them go to worship, they might take advantage of the situation. And instead of returning to slavery, they will return or rebel or declare their independence in his country, or join forces with other nations and attack him. So by not allowing them to go too far, or by leaving behind their women, or by leaving behind their children or their cattle, which are constantly what Paro tries to do, whilst they're leaving something behind, then he's safe. Then Paro's safe, and Egypt is safe. What Paro doesn't want them is to leave, even for a short time, with everything, because they might see an opportunity to rebel, to come back and attack or rebel against him, or assert their independence. So when Bnei Israel leave Egypt, what Paro feared most is exactly what happened. Bnei Israel don't go to the desert. Instead, they march away, and they're armed. They have their own possessions, a significant amount of wealth, everything they need to declare independence. And as soon as Paro realizes that they're not going into the desert, he concludes he has a rebellion on his hands, exactly as he thought. And he launches a preemptive strike before they attack him. And with this in mind, let's suggest an answer to all our questions. Even though Moshe had told Bnei Israel of Hashem's promise to take them to Canaan, had the Egyptians heard this rumor, they would have scoffed at the very thought. Could a bunch of slaves possibly organize themselves into an independent nation? Could they survive the journey into the desert? Could they conquer the kingdoms of Canaan? Are any neighboring lands as good as Egypt? No one was keeping any secrets. Even the majority of Bnei Israel felt this idea would lead to national suicide. It wasn't that they were keeping secrets, that this wasn't considered a realistic anything. Throughout the book of Sefer Shemot and the book of Bamidbar, we find people time and again expressing their desire to go back to Egypt. In addition to the explanation that Hashem has no intention of fooling Paro, one could even suggest that there's a thematic value in the fact that Moshe's request from Paro is simply for religious freedom and not for the right to emigrate. Let's see why. At the story of the Exodus and Hashem's mission to Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush, it focuses on two independent issues. Number one, to redeem Bnei Israel from Egypt, to fulfill Brit Avot, the covenant to the forefathers. And two, to teach Paro the lesson of Ani Hashem, of I am Hashem. It's to teach the Paro and Egypt that the God of Israel exists and that he runs the world. So it's a twofold mission, right? At the burning bush, Hashem charges Moshe with both these missions. Let's ask a more basic question. Why must Moshe confront Paro in the first place? If the entire purpose of the coming out of Egypt, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, is simply to fulfill Berit Havot, the covenants to the forefathers, and to take Bnei Israel to Canaan, why involve Egypt in the process at all? Surely Hashem could have created circumstances where Bnei Israel would emigrate without official Egyptian authorization. For example, God could have changed the policy of Egypt, or make a miracle where all the Egyptians fall asleep for 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever. Hashem could have done that, and they could have just marched out without the permission of Egypt or Paro. Why was the need to involve Paro and Egypt? And yet we see at the burning bush how Hashem insists that Bnei Israel must receive Paro's permission to leave. Moshe must deal with Paro. This is part of the mission. It constitutes a critical element of Hashem's plan. Hashem doesn't tell Moshe to trick Paro. Rather, Moshe must confront Paro with the fundamental issue of religious freedom. The basic right of any people, especially an oppressed nation, to to worship Hashem. The fact that Paro, the king of Egypt, the world's superpower and the center of civilization at that point, rejects this request shows that he considers himself above his fellow man. He acts as though he himself is a god. And Hashem must teach him and any future Paros or monarchs the lesson of Vayede'u Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. The lesson of, because Mitzrayim, so Mitzrayim will know that I am Hashem. That Egypt will know I am Hashem. So therefore, the primary goal of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the coming out of Egypt, is that Egypt will realize that Hashem is above mankind. Again, Ve'yede'u Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. Moshe must deliver this message to the Egyptian people. He must deliver it in God's name, directly to Paro. The plagues ensure that the Egyptians internalize this message. On the other hand, from Bnei Israel's perspective, the central purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the coming out of Egypt, relates to the fulfillment of Hashem's covenant with our forefathers, that Bnei Israel return to Canaan, to become Hashem's special people. And as Bnei Israel prepares for this redemption, Moshe conveys this message to them. In conclusion, it's interesting to note the interrelationship between these two aspects of the Exodus. As we explained in Sefer Bereshit, which we just finished a few weeks ago, the goal of the Jewish nation is to establish a model society that can bring the whole of mankind to recognize Hashem. It's crucial that at Yetziat Mitzrayim, at the very moment when Israel becomes a nation, Egypt, the center of ancient civilization and the epitome of a society that rejects God, must recognize Hashem, must recognize God, specifically now when Am Yisrael becomes a nation. Shabbat Shalom.